Well, joining us now in the studio for more is Dr. Emmanuel Navon, Research Fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security and an international relations expert. Emmanuel, thanks for joining us. Let's start with this agreement, if you can call it, between the IAEA and Iran, or settling this dispute. Does this, in fact, represent some kind of concession from Iran, or is it just another way of its sort of tactic of going out and sort of probing how far it could go?
I wouldn't call this a concession. I mean, the negotiations are now going to start, and the bottom line is going to be whether or not the Iranians are going to be willing to make concessions. As your report said, who's going to blink first? And that's the real question. I mean, we've heard these statements from the Iranian supreme leader saying that if Iran wants to reach to 60%, they'll do it. And the question is really if they're going to blink, if the United States is going to maintain the sanctions. Of course, if the Biden administration were to lift those sanctions, despite Iran not negotiating, it would very much affect its credibility and deterrence vis-a-vis the Iranians. But at the end of the day, the question is, are the Iranians today really willing to give in something because of the sanctions and because of the economic price of those sanctions? Right.
Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu held consultations today with his team that he sort of assembled to deal with the Iran nuclear issue. The key person seems to be Mayor Ben Shabbat, head of the National Security Council, Yossi Cohen, of course, for the time being, alternate Prime Minister, Defense Minister Benny Gantz. How should Israel be responding, especially in terms of its dialogue with the Biden administration, as Washington sort of starts to go into this either negotiating or pre-negotiating mode?
Well, I think this dialogue should not be in front of the cameras. It should be a dialogue between the Netanyahu government, the outgoing Netanyahu government, and the incoming Biden administration. It should be a discreet dialogue behind the scenes, not in front of the cameras. And let me just remind you that when Netanyahu went to Congress, to the U.S. Congress in March 2005, and gave this long speech against President Obama, he did not achieve what he wanted to achieve. There was no two-thirds majority in Congress to block the agreement. So I think the way to deal with the Biden administration is really to establish a working relationship based on mutual trust, to make sure that, as Secretary of State Antony Blinken said, I think the goals of the Biden administration should be acceptable to Israel, to push as much as possible the sunset clause, to make sure that the mechanism to enforce the agreement is much stronger than it used to be, and also that the new agreement addresses Iran's support for terrorism around the region and its missiles program. I think all those goals are acceptable as far as Israel is concerned, and we have to make sure that the Biden administration has the will and the ability to negotiate them with Iran.
I want to pick out one of the points you just mentioned, and that is Iran's support for terrorism groups and its proxies throughout the region. Reports coming out now, and I don't have confirmation on that, maybe more rocket attacks in Baghdad by these Iran-linked militias. Usually they're the suspects there. We're also seeing increased activity in Yemen with the Houthi rebels. Do you put that in the context of perhaps another sort of pressure tactic by Iran, kind of raising the stakes ahead of these talks?
Absolutely. The Iranians are using those tactics, and we know, for example, you mentioned the Houthis in Yemen. The Biden administration already has announced that it's not going to support the Saudi regime in its war against the Houthis. So already there's a change of policy vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia and Iran. But at the end of the day, the United States wants to address, I believe, the missile program of Iran. And here, of course, they have a partner with the Europeans, because the Europeans, at least the European Union, France and Germany, and of course also the United Kingdom, are also co-signatories of the JCPOA. And they're potentially threatened also by Iran's long-range missiles. And here I think that, of course, the Iranians are using the threats the same way that Khamenei threatened to enrich uranium over 60%. These are, of course, negotiating techniques vis-a-vis the United States. And as I said, at the end of the day, we'll know in the coming weeks whether or not the Biden administration has the ability and the will to negotiate it with a tough line. And that will depend, of course, also on the position and on the policy of the other signatories, especially China and Russia.
Right. And we should mention France. According to reports, the Iranians have ICBM technology to enable them to target Paris already at this stage. Dr. Emmanuel Navon, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.